Hey there, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something that's been everywhere in the news, microplastics. You sent us some research on how these tiny plastic particles are impacting our bodies, our immune systems in particular, and, well, we had to dig in.
It's a topic with some potentially huge implications.
To unpack this, we're looking at a study from Friedrich Alexander Universität Erlangen-Nuremberg. So these researchers wanted to know if microplastics mess with our macrophages, those cells that are like, I don't know, tiny garbage trucks in our bodies.
And they didn't use just any cells for this study. They used primary human macrophages, the real deal.
Oh, wow. So straight from the source.
Yeah, taken straight from donor blood cells, which makes the findings even more relevant to you.
So no oversimplifying things with cell lines here. They got down to the nitty-gritty using electron microscopy, live cell imaging, talk about a front row seat to the microscopic world, and flow cytometry to actually track these microplastics and see how the cells were reacting.
What's so fascinating is they found these macrophages. They do take in those microplastics.
They do.
Polystyrene, specifically, in this case. And this is important. The more microplastics they were exposed to, the more they gobbled up. That concentration-dependent uptake is key here. It means there's a correlation between exposure and the potential impact.
Okay, so I was right to be concerned about those microplastics. This study is showing they are getting into our cells, and the more exposure we have, the worse it could be. And it gets even more interesting. This buildup of microplastics isn't just hanging out in the macrophages, it's causing some serious problems.
They observed a significant increase in cell death, specifically necrosis, in the macrophages exposed to those higher concentrations of microplastics.
Hold on, cell death? That can't be good.
It's definitely a cause for concern, especially because this is a relatively new area of research. We don't fully understand the long-term impact of lower levels of microplastic exposure over time, which is probably more in line with, everyday experiences.
So this study is like a snapshot, and we need a much longer film to see the full picture. Now, before anyone panics, it's important to mention this study was done in a very controlled lab setting. The microplastic concentrations were higher than what's typically found in the human bloodstream, based on current research at least.
That's true. It's not like we're all walking around with those high levels of microplastics in our systems right now, but,
Right.
It does raise some red flags and highlights the need for further investigation, especially, and this is key, when you consider the potential for long-term exposure.
Right, because those tiny bits of plastic are everywhere, and it's not like they just disappear, poof. Now, this is where it gets even more intriguing. The researchers, they also wanted to know if microplastics mess with how macrophages switch between different states, like, from attack mode to defense mode. They looked at whether the microplastics affected the macrophages' polarization.
And this is critical because macrophages are essential for a balanced and effective immune response. They need to be able to switch gears depending on the threat.
Right, makes sense.
What they found was, at least in the short term, the microplastics didn't directly impact this macrophage balancing act.
So it's not like those microplastics were flipping a switch, forcing the macrophages into one state or another. That's surprisingly good news.
It is interesting, but it doesn't mean there's no impact at all. They did observe a significant increase in something called nitric oxide production in the macrophages exposed to higher microplastic concentrations.
Ah, nitric oxide. Now that's one of those molecules that's kind of a big deal in the body, right? I know it's involved with blood flow. But what does it have to do with our immune cells?
Well, it's a key player, but like a lot of things in the body, it's all about balance. Nitric oxide helps our immune system fight off those invaders, but too much of it can actually cause damage and inflammation.
So, not so good then. It's like those macrophages are getting stressed out from all the plastic and releasing this nitric oxide as like a distress signal.
That's a good way to think about it. And it makes you wonder if these microplastics are causing this kind of stress response in macrophages. What else could they be doing in the body?
Right. And remember, this study only looked at polystyrene. Makes you think about all the other types of plastic swirling around out there.
Exactly. And it gets even more complex when you factor in the eco-corona.
The what corona? Okay, I know we're talking about microplastics, but that sounds a little too close to home.
It's not a virus, don't worry. The eco-corona refers to the coating of chemicals that microplastics can pick up in the environment. Think of it like this. Microplastics are like these tiny little sticky balls. And as they're traveling through the environment, they're picking up all sorts of things along the way, like pesticides, industrial chemicals, you name it.
So it's not just the plastic itself, but also whatever it's carrying along with it.
Precisely. And that changes the game entirely. because now you have this really complex mixture of substances that could potentially interact with our cells.
That's a really good point. The study only looked at the impact of, like, pristine microplastics. But in the real world, those microplastics are anything but pristine. They're covered in this cocktail of chemicals that could be adding to the problem.
Exactly. And this eco-corona, it could be influencing how easily those microplastics are taken up by cells, or even how toxic they are once they're inside. It's like the difference between getting a little dust on you and being, I don't know, covered in mud.
Okay, that's a visual I can work with. This is starting to sound pretty complicated, but let's zoom back in on the study for a moment. One thing that really struck me was the way they used all these different imaging techniques. It's one thing to talk about microplastics interacting with our cells, but to actually see it happening. Mind-blowing.
I agree. The images were incredible. Like, for example, they used electron microscopy, which let them see those polystyrene microplastics inside the macrophages in incredible detail.
It's like they provided photographic evidence of these microplastics setting up shop in our bodies. It's not just a theory, it's really happening.
Right. And then there's the live cell imaging. They actually got to watch in real time as those macrophages engulfed the microplastics. Wow. It really highlights the dynamic nature of these interactions.
It's like a microscopic feeding frenzy, with the macrophages trying to clean up this mess of microplastics. You could actually see how the macrophages were changing shape as they were taking in those tiny particles. It really brought the whole process to life.
Absolutely. And they were able to track the movement of those microplastics within the cells over time.
So they weren't just sitting there passively once they were inside. What were they up to?
We don't know all the answers yet, but that movement could be important. It might influence where those microplastics end up in the cell, what kind of impact they ultimately have. Now, we've talked about how this study looked at cell death and macrophage polarization, but they also looked at something called reactive oxygen species, or ROS.
ROS, okay. Now, those ring a bell. Don't they have something to do with cellular damage? It's like a cellular version of rust, right?
That's a good analogy. ROS are a natural byproduct of the processes happening inside our cells. It's like exhaust from a car.
Right.
A little bit is normal, but too much can lead to problems like inflammation and damage.
So did they find that these microplastics were causing a spike in this cellular rust?
Interestingly, they didn't see a significant increase in overall ROS production in the macrophages exposed to polystyrene microplastics. And this is big. ROS is a broad term.
Okay.
There are different types of these reactive species, and they might have different effects.
So it's like saying the weather is fine when you could be experiencing a blizzard in one place and a heat wave in another. They needed to narrow it down.
Precisely. And that's what they did. They also looked specifically at nitric oxide, which we talked about earlier, and that's where they saw a significant increase in the macrophages that were exposed to those higher concentrations of microplastics.
So even though the overall ROS levels were okay, the fact that nitric oxide was elevated means those microplastics could still be causing some damage, right?
It's definitely a sign of potential stress in the cells. And it really highlights how important it is to look at multiple markers, not just rely on one measurement to try to get the full picture.
Like trying to diagnose a cold based on just a cough, you might miss other important symptoms. This research is really fascinating. But it also feels like we're just starting to understand how much we don't know about microplastics.
Exactly. And it makes you think about the bigger picture. Like, if microplastics are causing this kind of stress response in macrophages, what else could they be doing in our bodies? We've been talking about these macrophages like they're these tiny warriors, and now I'm picturing them getting bogged down by all this plastic.
It's like giving them plastic shields and swords when what they really need is the real deal, to fight off infections and keep our immune system strong.
That's a great analogy. And it really highlights the potential for, broader downstream effects on immune function. This study didn't directly investigate those scenarios, but it definitely raises some red flags.
It does. This has been an incredible deep dive. It's amazing to think that something as seemingly insignificant as these tiny plastic particles could have such potentially far-reaching effect on our health. What are some of the big, unanswered questions that researchers are still trying to figure out?
One of the biggest ones is the role of that eco-corona we were talking about. How does that coating of chemicals change the way those microplastics are interacting with our cells? Does it make them more likely to be taken up by macrophages or more toxic once they're inside? Those are some really crucial questions we still need answers to.
Yeah, those hitchhiking chemicals add a whole other layer of complexity to this. It's like they're sneaking into our bodies undercover.
And we've mainly focused on polystyrene here. What about all the other types of plastic? Do they have different effects?
Another great question. And the answer, unfortunately, is that we don't have all the answers yet. We need more research looking at the effects of different types of microplastics, different sizes, shapes, and different levels of exposure, especially long-term exposure, to really understand the full scope of this. So much to explore. This deep dive makes you think twice about all the plastic in our lives. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
It is a lot to process, but knowledge is power, right? Understanding the potential risks is the first step toward finding solutions.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of microplastics and their impact on our bodies. Keep those questions coming and we'll keep digging deeper into the science that matters. Until next time.